At 4:59 a.m., Tovey requested that the 4th Destroyer Flotilla begin to transmit call sign signals using sufficient power for homing in order to enable those aboard King George V to calculate their shadowing positions as well as the approximate position of Bismarck. Dawn arrived 1 minute later, bringing with it rain squalls that drifted across the storm-tossed seascape. During the breaks in the squalls, visibility up to 10 miles was possible. With the home fleet closing in and preparing to strike, Van was confident that Bismarck could no longer elude the forces gathering against her. Shortly after dawn, the loudspeakers aboard Bismarck crackled once more as the order was piped, "Prepare aircraft for launching." Lutyens had few doubts as to the fate of the ship in the face of the Royal Navy opposition that he was sure was massing, and wanted the ship's war diary saved so that Raeder and others within the Oberkommando der Marine might have a true record of the operation and the details of the actions so as to be able to draw conclusions for the future. Lutyens also wanted to send home footage taken by cameramen aboard Bismarck of the sinking of the Hood and the accounts of the battle written by reporters. The large hangar door was opened by the deck crew, and one of the Arado aircraft was pushed out, whereupon it was lifted by crane onto the launching rails and pushed to one end before being linked to the catapult. A pilot and observer were selected. They promptly went below to dress in their flying suits. They could hardly believe their luck, for, against all the odds, they were going to escape the ship and would not have to share the same fate of many and die on board. In less than 4 hours they would be in France, drinking fresh coffee, eating fresh bread rolls, telephoning home, and would be, above all, safe. The war diary was brought down from the bridge along with the cans containing the reels of film and the written reports of the Battle of the Denmark Strait. Placed inside a waterproof bag, they were then stowed inside the aircraft. When word got round that one of the ship's aircraft was to be launched, many men scribbled little notes on any scrap of paper that they could find to send loving thoughts to sweethearts and to mothers, which were pressed into the hands of the airmen. Finally, the pilot and observer climbed into the cockpit. The Arado's BMW engine was started and allowed to warm up for a few minutes. When the final preparations had been made and the aircraft was ready to be launched, word was passed to the bridge, whereupon Lindemann did what he could to bring Bismarck broadside into the wind. It was not an easy task, for, as Bismarck turned, the wind and sea caught her, causing her to roll. The catapult operator pulled the lever that would send the Arado shooting across the rails into the air, but nothing happened. The Arado remained on the rails, the engine continuing to race. Once more, the flight operations officer gave the signal, and once more the catapult operator pulled the lever. Again, the aircraft remained in place. An inspection of the catapult equipment was made, where it was found that the compressed air pipe had been fractured, a hole torn in it by a fragment of 14-inch shell from HMS Prince of Wales, which had damaged the captain's launch. Engineers were summoned to take a look at the pipe. Upon inspecting it, they declared that the fracture could not be repaired at this time and place. The effort to fly off the war diary and the other records was subsequently abandoned. Gloom settled over Bismarck. While men became lost in their thoughts and their fates, some questioned where the British were, having expected to encounter the home fleet at daybreak. Shortly after 8:30 a.m., the alarm bells rang out, summoning men to their action stations. The air crews of the serviceable Swordfish had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing for another strike. Shortly after 6 a.m, the final preparations were made. The wind was by now gusting at over 57 miles per hour. Such was the ferocity of the wind that the Swordfish had their engines started as arc rails sailed away from the wind, while extra men were mustered on deck to hold the aircraft steady. Once all of the Swordfish were ready with their engines running, arc rail turned into the wind, and the Swordfish with torpedoes took off one after the other in rapid succession. HMS Norfolk, meanwhile, had worked her way around in the pre-dawn darkness to the north of the enemy so as to be able to flank mark for Torvey. With the breaking of dawn, Norfolk was confronted by an empty seascape. Wake Walker issued instructions for the cruiser to sail down the last direction-finding bearing of Van's destroyers, and at 7:53 a.m, Bismarck hove into view at a range of 9 miles. Bismarck did not open fire and was lost to sight 10 minutes later. As they closed in, the final preparations were made aboard King George V and Rodney. As the former commanding officer of Rodney, Torvey knew that, unlike his flagship, the elder vessel had 2 torpedo tubes in her bow below the waterline. At 7:25, he flashed a signal to Dalrymple-Hamilton. If opportunity permits, fire your torpedoes. At 8:21, King George V and Rodney were sighted approaching from the west by those aboard Norfolk at a range of 12 miles. Via signal lamp, Wake Walker signaled the distance and bearing of the enemy. As they approached, it had been necessary for King George V and Rodney to alter course to avoid the rain squalls, and to allow for the reported alterations of course made by Bismarck. At 8:43, she was sighted at a range of 14.2 miles, bearing 118 degrees, steering directly towards the 2 British battleships. Aboard the British battleships, the final preparations were made. Guns were loaded and elevated as turrets were traversed. Then, at 8:47, at a range of a little over 13 miles, Rodney opened fire. One minute later, King George V opened fire, followed at 8:49 by Bismarck. As the dull drumbeat of the 14-inch guns of King George V sounded out, those aboard Rodney saw 4 wicked-looking flashes on Bismarck, indicating that 4 tons of German steel were hurtling towards the battleship as Bismarck opened fire in response. Those aboard Bismarck recognized the importance of inflicting damage swiftly, or knocking out Rodney with her 9 16-inch guns. As such, fire was initially concentrated against her. Furthermore, it was assumed by Lutyens that King George V was the same battleship that Bismarck had encountered and damaged in the Denmark Strait, and therefore she was less of a threat than Rodney. As Bismarck shells splashed down, large columns of water erupted ahead of Rodney. Due to her bow-on approach to Bismarck, Rodney was only able to fire her 2 forward turrets until 8:53, when an alteration of course to port was made, following a near-miss straddle from Bismarck. The turn to port executed by Rodney was made despite a signal flag flying from the halyards of King George V, instructing the 2 ships to turn to starboard together onto a course of 085 degrees. As Rodney had not recently been operating as part of the home fleet, Dalrymple-Hamilton was unaware of Torvey's preference for an end-on approach and, therefore, executed the turn to port in order to open A arcs. From this point, the 2 British battleships would be separated. The opening salvos fired by Bismarck directed at Rodney were fired from turrets Anton and Bruno. The salvos landed wide, although some shell fragments from the exploding shells did land aboard Rodney and penetrated the light superstructure plating. As Rodney executed a turn to port towards where the first salvo from Bismarck had landed, the second salvo from the German battleship crashed down 200 yards astern. Another salvo was fired at 8:58 am, which straddled Rodney amidships, sending tons of water crashing over the decks as splinters rattled against the hull. In the meantime, at 8:54, Norfolk had joined the battle. A minute later, Dalrymple-Hamilton ordered a turn to starboard in order to throw off the aim of the German gunners. The main battery efficiency of Bismarck began to fall off, and by 8:58, those aboard Rodney were less concerned with it than they had been minutes earlier. By this time, the 6-inch secondary armament of the battleship, as well as the 5.9-inch guns of Bismarck, were also engaged in the battle. On orders of the secondary gunnery officer, the port 5.9-inch guns targeted King George V, while the starboard guns initially engaged Norfolk under local control. For her part, Norfolk had entered the battle at a range of just under 12.5 miles and maintained a steady volume of fire during the early stages of the battle, scoring hits on Bismarck's superstructure and starboard 5.9-inch turrets. These hits complemented several hits scored by Rodney on the foredeck of Bismarck. Aboard King George V, at the beginning of the engagement, high explosive shells had been loaded, as they created large plumes of water, which were useful in spotting the fall of shot and determining the range. Once the range had been determined to be somewhere in the region of 13.5 miles, a switch was made to 14-inch armor-piercing shells. Hits were scored early on with the armor-piercing shells. However, rather than penetrate Bismarck's hull, they detonated upon contact with her armor. During the opening salvos, King George V fired with A and B turrets. When the blast from these 6 guns came, the compass jumped around in the binnacle, and tin hats were blown to the deck, while a pile of signal flags in the lower bridge was sent swirling into the air. A problem soon arose for the 2 British battleships. Wind blowing in from the northwest carried the cordite smoke from their guns, as well as the smoke from their stacks, towards Bismarck. The smoke obscured visibility and made it difficult for spotters to see their target clearly, meaning it took time for the 2 battleships to register significant hits. A further complication was Bismarck herself, which threw off the aim of the British gunners by making abrupt changes in heading to port or starboard as she was blown about in the storm and as a result of her yawing and pitching. Without the ability to steer, Bismarck was at the mercy of the weather. Her beam periodically came parallel to the oncoming wave crests, which made gunnery difficult. Despite the fact that the motions of the ship complicated the operation of the gunnery computers, salvo fire was held fairly well until Bismarck began to sustain damage to her forward turrets and bridge structure. Indeed, steady fire was maintained until 8:58. Lindemann was unable to maneuver Bismarck to provide a more favourable heading for his gunners, or to avoid the incoming British shells. Owing to the inability to maneuver, Bismarck was restricted to firing turrets Anton and Bruno. Turrets Caesar and Dora were unable to be brought to bear owing to the end-on approach of the British. By 8:59, the inability to steer allowed the incoming sea and severe yaw to push Bismarck to starboard, exposing her broadside to the fire of King George V and Rodney. Columns of water from incoming shells that erupted around Bismarck further impeded visibility, and sent tons of water cascading onto her decks and superstructure. Some of the water made its way into ventilation shafts and boiler intakes, causing flooding on the lower decks. This water began to surge with the motion of the ship and led to a free surface effect, which began to erode the stability of the ship. All the while, the range between the British battleships and Bismarck continued to close. At 8:59 a.m., an 8-inch shell from Norfolk hit the foretop director, which disrupted the central fire control function and resulted in the deaths of the men manning the position. From 9 a.m., Bismarck's fire became ever more erratic. Shortly after 9 a.m., a 14-inch shell from King George V struck the faceplate of turret Anton, disabling the turret with its guns trained aft of the beam. A couple of minutes later, at 9:02, a salvo of 16-inch shells from Rodney crashed down around the bow of Bismarck in the vicinity of the forward turrets. One shell struck the 13-inch barbette armour of turret Bruno and tore a hole in the deck structure of the barbette's port side before exploding, sending hot fragments into the interior, where some powder charges and cartridges were ignited. This created something of a firestorm within the barbette and gunhouse, which resulted in the deaths of all those within the turret. Either another shell from this salvo from Rodney, or perhaps a 14-inch shell from King George V, also struck the main deck in the vicinity of turret Bruno, sending fragments against the overhanging portion of the turret, weakening the support structure of the armour back wall. The build-up of pressure within the turret from the firestorm dislodged the backplate, which fell to the deck, whilst also lifting and pitching the turret forward in the barbette, leaving the guns pointed at an angle of 85 degrees to port at different elevations. From his vantage point aboard Rodney, Len Nickel was awed by the destructive power unleashed and saw the back of B turret explode when one of the shells hit her. To him, the backplate appeared to be flipped up into the air, spinning like a penny. The bow area was engulfed in a sheet of flame, while a serious blaze began to rage amongst the combustible materials in the forward crew quarters of the battery deck. In the aft fire control position, Mullenham Reichberg was scanning the horizon through his director when he finally saw Norfolk. With King George V and Rodney not yet visible from the aft director, he began to wonder if the ship's command would decide to divide the ship's fire. As he pondered this, an indirect answer was received from Oberleutnant zur See Frederick Cardinal.
Cardinal came on the control telephone and said that the main fire control station in the foretop was out of action or, at any rate, could not be contacted, that turrets Anton and Bruno were out of action, and that I was to take over control of turrets Caesar and Dora from aft. He said nothing about the forward fire control station. I suppose that it would continue to direct the secondary battery, unless it had been disabled, which seemed not unlikely in view of the number of times the forward section of the ship had been hit. There was not time to ask long questions.
Taking control of the aft guns, Mullenham Reichberg trained the port director as far forward as possible and began to scan the horizon. There was no sign of Rodney to port or to starboard. The battleship, at the time, was likely in the blind spot forward of the aft director. Slightly abaft the beam, steering a reciprocal course, however, appeared King George V. Within seconds of receiving the report ready, Mullenham Reichberg gave the order to fire one salvo. As the salvo flew through the air towards King George V, preparations were made for a second salvo. The guns were reloaded while Mullenham Reichberg relayed targeting information. On the Admiral's Bridge of King George V, as Bismarck opened fire at the flagship, Commander Alan Campbell, the fleet gunnery officer, engaged in the tradition of calling out the estimated flight time of shells before they hit the target. Time of flight, 35 seconds, he called out, beginning the countdown. Campbell was quickly silenced by Tovey, who declared that he preferred not to be given the exact moment a 15-inch shell would hit him in the stomach. The 15-inch shells failed to score any hits. Over the next few minutes, there would be a number of near misses. The closest that Bismarck came to scoring a hit on the British flagship was when a shell from one of her 5.9-inch guns burst around 50 yards short of the conning tower. As King George V and Rodney continued to fire shells at Bismarck, Tovey scanned the German battleship with a pair of binoculars to watch the shells land and score hits. Deciding that he could not see enough, from the Admiral's Bridge, he used the internal telephone system to call down to Captain Patterson on the compass platform. "Close the range. Get closer. I can't see enough hits." In the aft director of Bismarck, Wilhelm Rechberg and his two petty officers suddenly had their heads bounced hard against the sights as the director shuddered violently. Following a brief moment of perplexion and wonder at what had caused the vibration, Wilhelm Rechberg began to look through the sights once more to bring King George V back into view. As he looked, the battleship was nowhere to be seen. All that was visible was a wall of blue. After a few seconds, it dawned on him that the director had been shattered. A 14-inch shell had passed less than 6 feet overhead and carried away anything that protruded, including the director sights. Bismarck was now without centralized fire control. Calls were placed to the computer rooms, neither of which could raise the forward fire control station. With his station blind, Wilhelm Rechberg informed the commanders of turret Caesar and Dora that they were free to choose their own targets and to fire independently. At 9:02 a.m., HMS Dorsetshire joined the fray. At 8:33, lookouts aboard the cruiser had sighted a destroyer bearing 294 degrees at a range of 8 miles. When challenged, the destroyer revealed herself to be HMS Cossack, which reported Bismarck to be on a course of 290 degrees 6 miles further on. At 8:50, having sailed over 600 miles from the south since the enemy report came in, gun flashes from the dueling battleships could be seen to the westward. At 9:04, Captain Martin swung Dorsetshire broadside onto target and issued the order to open fire at a range of 10.3 miles. All 8 of the ship's 8-inch guns belched fire and smoke. As he stood on the exposed bridge wing, Martin was doused in spray as the guns fired. He turned to a rating beside him to take a fresh pair of binoculars so that he could see whether or not the shells hit the target. One of the shells hit the 35-foot rangefinder located on top of the foretop fire control station and tore away the radar antenna mounted to the base of the rangefinder. Between 9:04 and 9:13 a.m., an 8-inch shell from Dorsetshire struck the forward starboard 5.9-inch turret, jamming the access hatch, trapping the crew inside, sealing their fate. Dorsetshire had to check fire at 9:13 owing to the difficulty of spotting her shells amongst those from the battleships and Norfolk. Fire was resumed with full salvos at 9:20, but spotting the fall of shot was still difficult. Fire was again checked at 9:23 as Cossack passed between the cruiser and Bismarck. 3 minutes later, Dorsetshire altered course to port to close the range and maintain visual contact. Numerous explosions appeared to be occurring deep inside Bismarck. Shell bursts could be made out as they exploded, with the blast appearing to go inwards. Turret Caesar, firing under local control, loosed a salvo at Rodney, which was proceeding across the starboard bow of the German battleship. As Rodney crossed the starboard bow of Bismarck, midshipman G. R. Shaw estimated that the range between the two ships was 2 miles, with the 16-inch guns of Rodney taking devastating effect.
We closed the range and we came in from 27,000 yards finally to about 4,000 yards, and were pumping stuff into her pretty hard. And she kept up a desultory fire for a long time, a very, very brave action, because although we failed to sink her, we certainly we knocked her about, and she was on fire in many places, a lot of smoke, and you could see the shells crumping against her side.
At 9:10, Rodney altered course, which put the wind astern, improving conditions slightly so far as interference from funnel and cordite smoke was concerned. Rodney continued on this course, with Bismarck dropping astern up to 6.2 miles. As Bismarck began to fall astern, the 16-inch guns of Rodney had to be trained onto an astern bearing, which had the potential for devastating effect on the bridge structure from the blast of the guns. By this time, 33 salvos had been fired. A brief pause in gunfire aboard Rodney occurred from 9:14 until 9:18 as she settled onto her new course and began to close the range to Bismarck once more. As Rodney turned, 2 torpedoes were launched at a range of 4.2 miles. Neither of the torpedoes hit Bismarck, while a near miss from turret Caesar, a few yards off the starboard bow at 9:22, jammed the sluice valve door between the tube and sea, preventing the launching of further torpedoes from the starboard bow tube. From 9:16, Rodney became the chosen target of turrets Caesar and Dora. Shells landed close to the British battleship, but no hits were scored, although some shell fragments did penetrate light plating. Turret Caesar fired regularly during this period, but turret Dora was not in a regular rhythm. At 9:21, Dora was hit by a 16-inch shell and disabled. The 16-inch shell caused a premature explosion in the right-hand gun barrel. The flashback into the turret killed all personnel manning the guns, while the remaining members of the turret crew were left disorientated by the fumes, which burned torsos, singed hairs, and caused eyeballs to bulge from their sockets. 6 minutes later, turret Anton fired a solitary salvo before finally falling silent for good. At 9:30, the barbette of turret Dora was hit by a shell from Rodney, which tore open the main deck and exploded in the engineer's mess. At the time, the engineer's mess deck was being used as a dressing station. The shell killed all of the wounded as well as the medical personnel in the position. A minute later, turret Caesar fired its last salvo before finally being silenced by a shell from King George V, which struck the turret faceplate, disabling the gun training and elevating gear. With the silencing of turret Caesar, Bismarck's main battery had fired its last. Bismarck's list had steadily increased as the battle progressed. Shortly after turret Caesar and Dora had fell silent, fumes and smoke began to drift through the aft fire control station, causing the men there to put on gas masks from time to time. For the moment, they were trapped in their position by an inferno which raged outside. Inside their position, little was known about what was occurring elsewhere in the ship. Questions abounded. Was the ship's command still in the forward command post? Who was in command? Nothing had been heard from the forward sections of the ship since the battle began. Given the number of hits that had been felt, it was assumed that drastic changes had occurred forward. King George V was by now also closing the range to Bismarck, so much so that the ship's 5.25-inch secondary armament was ordered into action. Quickly, the 5.25-inch guns scored a considerable number of hits, while the spotting officers aboard the British flagship had no doubt that these guns, with their high rate of fire, had a devastating effect on the superstructure and the upper deck of the enemy. At around 9:45, machining freighter Herbert Walter and maschinenmat Heinrich Kundt were ordered to retrieve a white box marked with a red letter V, which contained explosives and a timing device. The explosives were placed on the cooling water intakes and the timer activated, whereupon Kundt and the other members of the port engine room left the position and began to make their way topside. Reaching the deck, Kundt found himself among a group of men who were gathering around the aft turrets. Here, every man had to decide for himself when to jump overboard into the water. Kundt inflated his life jacket and waited for a wave crest which would carry him away from the ship once he had jumped. Once in the water, he found a piece of wood to hold on to alongside a member of a prize crew. By this time, King George V was beginning to pass up the port side of Bismarck. While her secondary armament may have been ordered into action, the ship was suffering from issues with the 14-inch guns. A turret was out of action between 9:20 and 9:51 due to a mechanical malfunction. B turret, meanwhile, missed several salvos, and, for a short period, Y turret also suffered a mechanical breakdown and was disabled. Added to this, the No. 3 gun in A turret had suffered misfires which would later be attributed to a vent which did not clear smoke in the gunhouse. The gun was out of action for a period of 30 minutes while the crew cleared the gun chamber. The result of these issues was that King George V could only manage a salvo with 2 of her 14-inch guns during this period of the battle. At one point during this phase, a cordite bag failed to ignite, which required a safety check to be conducted, which kept the gun out of action for half an hour. While efforts were underway to repair the guns, someone noticed that the Polish midshipmen on board were suddenly absent from their action stations. A hasty search was mounted for the midshipmen, who were found at their lockers below decks, sharpening bayonets and knives, as they thought that, at any moment, a call would be issued to form a boarding party, which would bring with it the opportunity to settle old scores. As a search was mounted aboard King George V for the Polish midshipmen, aboard Bismarck, men began arriving in increasing numbers in the aft gunnery control position. Most arrived via the narrow emergency exit, where a perpendicular companionway led down to the aft gunnery reserve circuit space. It became clear to Mullenham-Reckberg that preparations were underway to scuttle the ship, although no clear orders had been given. Despite this and the obvious need to abandon ship, he did not allow the men gathered in the aft director to leave while shells were exploding over the superstructure and upper deck. According to Mullenham-Reckberg, to have left with shells and ready-use ammunition exploding would have been nothing less than suicide.
I did not give the order to leave until long after our guns had fallen silent, the enemy stopped firing and, presumably, the shooting had come to an end.
Bismarck was listing heavily to port, with starboard the lee side. He called for the men to look for a place aft and to starboard on the upper deck from where to abandon ship. There was too much destruction forward, and the smoke was unbearable. Meanwhile, the quarterdeck was not a suitable area. Bismarck was too far down by the stern, and the waves were breaking over the port quarter. Those who made the mistake of jumping from the port side, or who were washed overboard in that direction, were thrown back against the ship by the waves, often with fatal consequences. At 9:49, Rodney fired her 90th salvo at Bismarck. As Rodney moved slowly down Bismarck's starboard side, several hits were observed. With the range between the two battleships at approximately 2.2 miles, point blank for a battleship, such hits were devastating on the unarmoured superstructure and destroyed many of the 1.4-inch and 4.1-inch guns. One 16-inch shell made a clear penetration of the belt armour in the vicinity of the area where the torpedo hit from Victorious' Swordfish had been sustained. Bismarck was, at the time, listing between 15 and 20 degrees to port, meaning that the chance of penetration was lower due to ricochet, but rules to starboard negated that effect. 10 minutes later, Rodney made one of her final alterations of course to maintain the range to Bismarck at 2.2 miles. At this point, reports were received from King George V that some of the shells fired by Rodney were passing directly through Bismarck and exploding on the port side. Hitherto, Rodney had been firing armour-piercing shells with a time delay so that the shells would detonate after penetrating the armour. Following receiving these reports from King George V, from 10:03, Rodney commenced firing 8-gun broadsides with armour-piercing shells set with no delay. Between 10:08 and the final ceasefire, Bismarck would receive full-gun salvos from Rodney. It was not just Bismarck that was damaged by the salvos. With Rodney firing full-gun salvos at low elevation, increasing damage was caused to her weather deck and some bulkhead plating below the weather deck as a result of the gun blast. During the passage up the starboard side of Bismarck between 9:51 and 9:55 am, 3 torpedoes were fired by Rodney from her port torpedo tubes. The third torpedo that was launched leapt out of the water 2/3 of the way to the target. None of the torpedoes hit. Another torpedo was fired at 9:57. Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis claimed a hit at 9:58, while Lieutenant Campbell observed what he believed to be a torpedo hit near turret Bruno. In his after-action report, Dalrymple-Hamilton also reported 1 torpedo hit. If this was indeed correct, and Rodney did score a hit with the torpedo, it would have been the first and only time in history that a battleship was torpedoed by another battleship. While Rodney fired torpedoes at Bismarck, an air raid warning was received aboard King George V, based on decoded Luftwaffe transmissions. The 5.25-inch batteries were ordered to check fire and to stand by to put up a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Shortly thereafter, a Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor was spotted aft over the battle scene. With the appearance of the Condor, the ship's radar began to scan the skies for signs of approaching enemy aircraft. Around this time, Swordfish from Ark Royal also arrived over the battle scene. What they found was a scene of confusion and uncertainty. Unable to conduct a torpedo attack owing to the low-flying projectiles, the flight leader attempted to signal King George V that the Swordfish were prepared to launch an attack. On aircraft alert, in the mistaken belief that the Swordfish were enemy aircraft, the anti-aircraft crews aboard King George V opened fire. In this, the anti-aircraft crews failed to identify the aircraft they fired on and also the roundels on their fuselages and wings. With the home fleet pounding Bismarck, there was nothing for the air crews to do other than to circle overhead, watching the spectacle unfold below. Bismarck was now in her final minutes afloat. Preparations were being made aboard to aid the ship's sinking, as well as to abandon ship. Around 10:15, orders made it around the ship that she was prepared for sinking. Shortly thereafter, the transmission of orders collapsed. Bismarck was by now a shattered hulk of jagged and twisted metal, burning from stem to stern. With this, Torvey was now confident that Bismarck, in her current state, could never get back to harbour, and that it was only a matter of hours before she would sink. The fuel shortage aboard both King George V and Rodney had become acute. It was not just the issue of having sufficient fuel to reach a British port that Tovey had to contend with. He also had to consider the possibility of sustaining a ruptured fuel tank as a result of a near miss by a bomb or a torpedo hit. A ruptured fuel tank might result in the ship being forced to stop in an area where he had been warned to expect heavy air attack, or where U-boats were known to be gathering. With this in mind, and recognizing that further gunfire would do little to hasten the end of Bismarck, at 10:15 Tovey decided to break off the bombardment and issued instructions for any vessel with torpedoes to use them against the German battleship. While HMS Norfolk hauled away with King George V and Rodney, Dorsetshire approached from the south and, at 10:24, fired 2 torpedoes at the starboard side of Bismarck. One of the torpedoes was observed to explode in the vicinity of the bridge, while the other exploded amidships. Dorsetshire circled around the bow and fired a further 2 torpedoes at Bismarck's port side at 10:36, after which Bismarck heeled over further and sank lower by the stern. At 10:40 a.m. she rolled over and sank. Thus it was that Bismarck met her end. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more updates, like and share. You can also help to support the channel at Patreon. Details are in the description box below. If you enjoyed this content, why not also check out my Substack page for more unique historical insights and articles. A link to the page is in the description box below.